Ruth Ke'elikolani is the great-granddaughter of Kamehameha I. She served as the governor of Hawaii Island for over a decade. She, at her time, was known to be the most wealthiest Hawaiian on the islands. Her wealth came in the form of land assets, all inherited by being the great-granddaughter of Kamehameha I. Princess Ruth Ke'elikolani outlived two of her husbands and unfortunately 2 children. Without any children, she gave her vast wealth and estate to her cousin Bernice Pawahi Bishop in a will. Bernice Pawahi Bishop would marry Charles Reed Bishop. However, the two would go without any children. Upon her death, Princess Bernice Pawahi Bishop, in her will, wrote that her estate and her fortune was to go to a school to be created to better the educational status of Hawaiian children, and for this school to be known as the Kamehameha Schools. King David La'amea Kalakaua would serve as king for several decades as well. He was known as the Merry Monarch, as you already know, who traveled around the world promoting Hawaii's wealth and Hawaii's monarchy and vast culture. There was one last voyage in which Kalakaua would make, and in this picture, Kalakaua is seen with the white slacks. It would be the last picture that would be taken of him up until his death. Prior to traveling to San Francisco on business, he names his sister Lydia Dominus as heir apparent to the throne, shall anything happen to him. After traveling to San Francisco, the king falls ill and dies of health complications at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. The news got to the Hawaii, and Hawaiians mourned. His body was returned to Hawaii and honored in a funeral procession and state. He is later buried at the Royal Mausoleum in Nu'uanu till this day. That mausoleum is known as Mauna Ala. Lydia Liliu Dominus takes the throne after the death of her husband, King David La'amea, her brother, King David La'amea Kalakaua. Lydia Dominus would change her official state of name to Queen Liliuokalani as she takes the throne. She will serve as Hawaii's queen for just a little more than 2 years. During her time, she faces lots of constant disagreement with her cabinet makers and foreign businessmen. And Queen Liliuokalani makes an attempt to rewrite the Constitution of Hawaii to restore the power back to the monarchy. Upon hearing of this plan, a group of foreign businessmen, who are also a part of the Honolulu Rifles, an elite team of foreign businessmen, assembled and spoke of the Queen's attempt to restore the monarchy in her favor. The men formed a subcommittee known as the Committee of Safety and sent a letter to the U.S. Navy to help protect the financial assets and land of the foreign businessmen. Letter got to the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Navy landed at Honolulu Harbor on January 16th, 1893. The next day, outside in the back of Ali'i'olanihale, Lauren Thrick Smith claims Hawaii in the name of the provisional government and sees that Liliuokalani is unfit to serve as queen. This resulted in the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy January 17th, 1893. There was a series of events that led to the overthrow, one in which could be seen in the video at the next class. There was a matrix of things that Liliu faced. She faced the laws of occupation. The laws of occupation dictated private ownership of land. She also served with the Liliu assignment, which was her way in getting power restored back to the monarchy. During her time, there was a joint resolution of annexation to the islands of Hawaii. Hawaii being annexed to the state would allow foreign sugar to enter U.S. territories free of taxes. And the compensation of the taxes would be Pearl Harbor, in which would be given to the U.S. Naval. This also led to the Organic Act of 1900. Liliu once again faced all of this opposition, all nearly herself. There were a group of Hawaiians who tried to restore her back 2 years later, only to fail. In this picture, you see the Committee of Safety, that is also known as the Honolulu Rifles. They make up of several foreign businessmen such as Stanford B. Dole, Lauren Thwig Smith, to name a few. The Committee of Safety began their quest as the Honolulu Rifles. All of these individuals were descendants of missionary leaders in the islands. They were missionary children. And while their parents were busy spreading Christianity and converting Hawaiians to Christianity, they were out and about creating businesses and profiting for their family's benefit. I find it ironic that their parents were very, very holy and into the gospel as well as the Word of God, but none of their children of the missionaries took their place or form. Once again, the Committee of Safety were the individuals that overthrew Queen Liliuokalani, January 17th, 1893. Robert Wilcox was sent by King David La'ameakala during the study abroad program in which he started during his reign. Robert Wilcox, a young boy, was sent to be trained at the Royal Military Academy in Italy. There he would serve and be educated, but also find his soon-to-be wife with 2 children. He would return with his wife and children in 1887, but during his return to Hawaii, after learning about Kalakaau's regime and influence of his cabinet members, he decided that Kalakaau's government was not fit for him to serve. So he moved back to San Francisco in hopes to escape from the political regime of Hawaii. Although Hawaii was still in his heart, he would return back to the islands in 1889. This would upset his wife, and the wife would give him an ultimatum. However, he would choose in favor of his country and his monarchy. And in 1889, he would return to the islands, and his goal, his attempt, was to get Kalakaua back his rightful power. And to do this, he tried to influence Kalakaua to write a new constitution for the monarchy of Hawaii. However, Kalakaua would die in San Francisco shortly after that. After some years of serving under Liliuokalani and the overthrow of 1893, in 1895, he would lead a rebellion of loyalists. These loyalists were at the will of the queen and trying to regain Queen Liliuokalani back to her throne. This would end up in a lot of warfare, guns amongst the islands. However, the loyalists were stopped and they were arrested, and because they were tried for treason, they would be put to death. Liliuokalani was also arrested as seen in this picture, and her imprisonment took place in the palace. She was locked up in a palace and all windows were boarded up. She spent a few months imprisoned in her own home of Iolani Palace. Upon learning about the death of the loyalists who tried to get her back to the throne, she abdicated with Stanford B. Dole and asked that the loyalists' lives would be spared. And in exchange, she would abdicate the throne of Hawaii to the provisional government, setting the loyalists' lives free. The later years of Liliuokalani, also known as Lydia Liliuokalani Dominus, she would remain in the house in which her husband John Dominus would build for her. She would live in Washington Place until her death, November 11th, 1917. Her will, her assets, her land trust will be used to form the Queen Liliuokalani Children's Center that would benefit desolate children and orphan Hawaiian children. She would be buried in the Kalakaua Crypt in Mauna Ala, the royal mausoleum. Up until her time, she would serve. Although no longer a queen, she still had the love and admiration of the people of Hawaii. Although Queen Liliuokalani was disposed, the monarchy of Hawaii and the royals were still around. The crown prince at the time were the Kawananakoas and the Kalanianaoles. Up until her death, it began the age of redefining Hawaiians as who we are, trying to reclaim our rightful heir of land and resources. Hawaii, after being annexed, had the opportunity of sending a delegate to the U.S. Congress. The very first delegate to the U.S. Congress was Robert Wilcox, who we spoke about a few slides earlier. However, the delegate that I wish to concentrate on now would be the second delegate to U.S. Congress, and that would be Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalanianaole. And he is the descendant of the Kalakauas. He is a cousin of the Kalakaua and Liliuokalani. And he is from the Kawananakoa clan. He is royalty and he is prince. And he was the second delegate to U.S. Congress. And he would be the author of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1919 and 1920. The Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920 was authored and introduced to the U.S. Congress, Jonah Kuhio Kalanianaole. This act was written in 1919 and later was shared in 1920. This was a rehabilitation program for the Aboriginal Native Hawaiians of Hawaii. In this act, they were to set aside 200,000 acres for the use of rehabilitating Hawaiians on the land. There were terms that the Congress abided and asked Kalanianaole to include. And these terms were, 1, a 99-year lease of the land that would cost them $1 a year. These 200,000 acres could not be any old land. It could only be zoned as 1, residential, 2, agricultural, or 3, pastoral lands. This is the difference. Residential land, you could only have a certain square footage of land for a house. Agricultural land, you must have a farm, and that could stretch anywhere from 1 to 5 acres. Pastoral lands were for the grazing of cattle, sheep, livestock, and that could also stretch from 5 to 30 acres of land. The lands were very rocky, barren, and out of the way. It lacked infrastructure such as roads, water, and at that time, electricity. Other terms that U.S. Congress demanded was that the rehabilitation of Aboriginal Native Hawaiians would only be qualified for Hawaiians that are at least 50% or half of the Aboriginal blood quantum. That means that you needed to be half Hawaiian. After the years went by, they realized that the amount of 50% Hawaiians were nearly dying off. Therefore, they would allow heirs to the original Hawaiians that are on the waiting list to be of at least 25% or 1/4 Aboriginal Hawaiian to inherit the lands under a 50% qualified Hawaiian. This would define Hawaiians, the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, and even to this day, There are tens of thousands of native Hawaiians that are waiting for their acreage of land, infrastructure, and there are hundreds and thousands of Hawaiians that died on the waiting list, leaving that waiting list number to their heir inherit of 25% students. In fact, I myself, I have inherited Hawaiian homelands. My mother was an Aboriginal native Hawaiian, and being her son, we were able to inherit the land out in Waianae. The Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920 proved very confusing for the native Hawaiians. To the native Hawaiians, the land could not be owned. The land was an inherent right. The land was inclusive, meaning everyone could use the land as long as you had the proper genealogy or lineal descent to the land, which means if you were born and raised in a particular ahupua'a, then with your birthright at that ahupua'a would gain you access and privileges to the resources such as food and water, to name a few. It also acknowledges and recognizes people of being the stewards of the land. Now, this Hawaiian Homes Commission Act was quite different because we went from a lineal descent right of land to blood quantum. This was exclusively only for Hawaiians that were of 50% or half ancestry. It was based on numbers of your genealogical heritage. They would need to trace very far back. 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 generations back. And this was all planned out to basically assimilate the Hawaiians. And basically it was planned out because Congress did not think that the native Aboriginal Hawaiians would live up until the 2000s. So this was basically a genocide in its own right. At this time, I would encourage you to read up on the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act with an article that was printed in the Wall Street Journal. Please find this article. If you go to our Laulima tab, you go to our Hawaiian Studies 100, under resources, go to readings. From readings, go to Unit 5 and read the article on Broken Promise. This is a part of your class, reading that article, Broken Promise. It is on PDF file in Laulima. The 200,000 acres of Department of Hawaiian Homelands were spread out throughout the 6 Hawaiian islands, 6 of 8 Hawaiian islands. On the island of Kauai, there are a little bit more than 20,000 acres. On the island of Oahu is a little bit more than 8,000 acres. On Molokai, a little bit more than 25,000 acres. In Lanai is actually just under 10 acres. In Maui, a little bit more than 31,000 acres. And on Hawaii Island, a little bit more than 117,000 acres. Total combined statewide is approximately 203,767 parcels of acres. This makes up the Hawaiian Homes Department lands. Once Hawaiians was awarded Department of Homelands, approximately 1922-1923, there began the second Renaissance, what we call Renaissance 2.0. It was claiming and reviving and sadly reinventing our culture. This started with a series of events, one of which was the bombing of Kaho'olawe. Kaho'olawe was completely ceded by the military back in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. As they were preparing for World War II, they ceded parts of Oahu such as Makua as well as Kaho'olawe for the purpose of military tactical training. This was to prepare the troops into going out toward forsaken countries. The bombing of Kaho'olawe Island caused a lot of Hawaiians to be very concerned about the motherland, being that they uphold the genealogy of the Kumulipo, Papahanao Moku, giving birth to the lands. Hawaiians began to occupy the island of Kaho'olawe to stop the bombing. And this started the PKO, or Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana. From there, lots of Hawaiian awareness and activism was taking place, such as fighting for Hawaiian homelands. Now, although the Hawaiian homelands are designated for Hawaiians, it lacked the infrastructure. So many Hawaiians, as you read in the article, were waiting for their lands. In the meantime, they were occupying designated Hawaiian homelands since they are rightfully Hawaiian. The Hawaii had a constitution in 1978. It was known as the Hawaii Con of 1978. And this started a series of Renaissance movements, reclaiming, reviving, and later as we entered 1980, 90, and the 2000s, we begin to reinvent our culture. We take other people's culture, such as Maori, Samoan, and Tahitian, find similarities between it, and call it off our own. Not necessarily good, but nevertheless, it's part of the 2.0 Renaissance movement. The 1978 Hawaii Constitutional Convention took place on Oahu Island. This was the time where Hawaiian culture was starting to be questioned. This was during the time of Governor George Ariyoshi. In this constitutional convention, they were allowed to change the constitution that was already written. They also made appropriations naming the Hawaiian language as an official language of the state of Hawaii. This meant that anyone who spoke the language had the right to use it, whether as at the court system, the bank system, public schools, or in state legislature. You had the right to speak Hawaiian language because it is recognized as an official language of the state. There is only two languages that is recognized in the state: Hawaiian language and English. It also formed the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. This was to oversee all of the 5F seeded trust land fund. 5F seeded trust land fund for all the lands that was ceded by the military and state. There is revenue that is generated from this ceded land. Half of the revenue is to go to the Hawaiian Kingdom, and the other half is to go to the general public. Now, the half that goes to the Hawaiian Kingdom needs to be managed by some sort of entity. Therefore, the state made their own state agency known as the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which controls and manages the ceded land revenue. This is a revenue-based organization. Up until recently, it became land-based with the acquisition of land because the state of Hawaii owes the Office of Hawaiian Affairs hundreds of millions of dollars. I'll give you an idea. For every plane that lands on Honolulu International Airport that is ceded land, there is a landing fee and a takeoff fee. Half of the fee goes to the Hawaiians, the other half goes to the general public. For every boat that launches and departs from Honolulu Harbor, there is a fee. The University of Hawaii sits on ceded lands. Every single park, every single school on this island and the Hawaiian Islands sits on ceded lands. Therefore, the land revenue generated from the schools, the university, the harbors, shopping centers, and the airports all contribute money to the 5F ceded funds. Recently, because the state owes the Office of Hawaiian Affairs hundreds of millions of dollars, they did a land swap for pay, which resulted in nearly the entire Kaka'ako Basin as payment for the money that was owed to OHA. It also formed the Hawaiian Studies program in the elementary schools. This mandated that all elementary schools from grades kindergarten to 6th grade were mandated to have Hawaiian studies to be taught to them in the classroom. It also mandated Hawaiian studies to be taught in grades 8th and 7th in order for any public school kid to graduate. This is all the result of the 1978 Hawaii Constitutional Convention. In the 90s and in the 2000s, there were amendments to revisit this constitution. Normally, states would revisit Adem make amendments to constitutions every 10 years. Hawaii has not had a constitutional convention since 1978. It became part of the voting opportunity many elections ago, but it was always shot down. Hawaiians are feared that if Hawaii was to have another constitutional convention, they could take away some of the mandates in the Constitution, such as the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which would be threatened. The Hawaiian Studies programs would be threatened, as well as Hawaiian language and other Hawaiian institutions. So Hawaiians and Hawaiian organizations made it part of their priority to stop any constitutional convention for fear of losing their programs and benefits for Native Hawaiians. And like I mentioned, the Hawaii movement begins. It really started with Kaho'olawe Island, like I mentioned, the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana that was used for military practice, tactical bombing. The PKO would occupy the land when they would hear of a military blockade that would be taking place. They would actually swim, paddle, or take a boat to the island, swim, occupy, and many times they were arrested and placed in federal prisons. But their reasons was to protect the land. It was the land that was calling them, and they felt that they were the protectors, the guardians of Kaho'olawe Island. Remember that Kaho'olawe was one of the children of Papa'anwakea. Kaho'olawe was actually the last island to be born, if you pay close attention to the Papa'anwakea trilogy and story. The Hawaiian Homes beneficiary, they began to occupy undeveloped Hawaiian homelands. Remember that these are lands that are rightfully designated for Hawaiian homes, but lack the infrastructure. They lack the infrastructure because the state and the city refuses to put in streets, sewers, waters, electricity for the purpose of building up these Hawaiian homeland subdivisions. So the restless Hawaiians begin to occupy land, and thus the Hawaiian Renaissance movement, the Hawaiian political movement, and the Hawaiian activism movement begins. We have spoke about Hawaiians reclaiming their culture, reclaiming their identity through the use of language, the use of recognition. Hawaiian culture, where it was revived, we started with the language. The language was never a dying race. The language was never feared of being lost because language was still being used within the households. But now language needed to be brought out and heard in the public. And so you needed to start in the school system. And because of the Constitutional Convention and the loophole of Hawaiian language being the official language, the state needed to open language speaking schools known as immersion schools. And these are things that was not foreseen and probably just put off to the side, thinking that Hawaiians would not be so passionate about their culture. Hawaiian language needed to be reinvented, which also came with the new lexicons. And lexicons is a term for the grammatical markings such as okinas and kahakos. In ancient Hawaii, they did not need the use of the okina and kahako because all of those things, pronunciations, definitions came quite naturally. Remember that the okina and the kahako was invented by the missionaries. Hula was revived. It was actually revived through the first Renaissance movement. This is through King David La'amea Kalakaua, as hula was brought back into the public. But even after that, there's lots of individuals that revive hula in their own natural way. And now there's hundreds of thousands of hula schools, some legitimate, some not so legitimate, all for the preparation of hula. And that's a whole political lecture in itself. But there's also things that needed to be reinvented. And what do I mean by reinvented? Martial arts. Hawaiians had their own form of martial arts. It was known as Lua, spelled L-U-A. Now, this type of lua is not seen in public. It was not for everyone to learn. This was more of the underground martial arts. These were the underground assassins. Not everyone were privileged. And for the individuals in ancient Hawaiian that knew how to do lua, they wouldn't be publicly advertising it, because it would be sort of like a target on their back, because they would be known assassins. And so people would go to try to condemn them or kill them before they could assassinate anyone else. But this began to be reinvented. They start to put up lua schools, and they start to finally start to put themselves out in the general public. But whether they're authentic or not remains to be seen, because nothing is documented. It's all hearsay. But back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, a lot of this lua martial arts went unknown. Tattooing. Tattooing has become reinvented. Tattooing with guns versus the traditional moli or teeth sharpening blades. These were all needed to be reinvented as well. The voyaging of the canoes. Now, we've learned from a Palauan master by the name of Mau Pialuk. He's not Hawaiian, but yet alone he taught Hawaiians he revived and also reinvented different theories, practices, and customs around voyaging. Spirituality, as you know, Hawaiians practice the worship of 40,000, 400,000 gods. And now most of us are with that Christian upbringing where we pray to basically one God. But all of these spiritualities, whether you wrap the tea leaf in a rock or you stack the rocks 3 high, those are all the reinvented spirituality or spiritual practices that were not known as Hawaiian culture. But today, they're identified as Hawaiian culture, which isn't so true. So now that you have taken my class and you know of these things, now you have somewhat of an idea of what is authentic and what is not, what has been revived and what has been reinvented. When you see someone with Polynesian tribal tattoos, and the tattoos are curved, or the tattoos are incorporated into a picture, that's not traditional tattoos. Hawaiian traditional tattoos are linear and basically on geometric shapes rather than pictures. They didn't tattoo names on their body as well. So we need to educate people of this reinvented Hawaiian culture. And by you taking Hawaiian Studies 100 helps you with that understanding and helps me educate the vast public about that.